Should you get the new Sony A7C or the A7 Mark III? These are two very comparable cameras, so much so that to some people, the A7C was even regarded as being completely underwhelming because it just seemed to be the exact same camera as the A7 III, just in a body that's ever so slightly smaller. As similar as they may be, there are still some differences that may not be so obvious, so here's 16 ways the A7C is different from the A7 III, starting with the form factor. The 7C is ever so slightly narrower than the 7 III. The main part of the body is really the same thickness, although the grip is much shallower now. It would seem that they've made the grip just small enough to fit the Z battery in there. In terms of height, the 7C has managed to shave off quite a bit of bulk thanks to the repositioned EVF and shorter mode dial. Otherwise, the rest of the top plate is only a smidge lower. Now, the slight reduction in dimensions might not sound very impressive, but the narrower body and especially the much reduced top clearance on the A7C does make a pretty significant difference when you are using this on smaller gimbals. But another physical difference between these two cameras that's going to be a lot more noticeable is weight. Although the A7C is only slightly smaller, it weighs about 140 grams lighter. That is a difference that you will surely feel when picking up these two cameras. It means that the A7C, with an on-camera mic like the DD-D4 Duo attached, is still lighter than the A7 III without a mic. It's also this weight reduction that allows the A7C with a small lens to still be well within the maximum payload of smaller gimbals like the Zhiyun Crane M2. Pretty cool to see a full-frame 4K camera on that little thing. And number 3 is the difference in control layout. In terms of controls, the A7C has become quite a bit more economic when compared to the A7 III. For example, there is one less dial now. That dial that's just under the shutter button is no longer there. There's only one custom button on the A7C as opposed to 4 on the A7 III. The joystick multi-controller is gone, but what the A7C does gain over the 7 III is a dedicated video record button on the top panel. The mode dial design has also been improved. You now get 3 custom memory modes on the A7C. There was only 2 on the A7 III, and now you no longer have to cross through them to get to video mode from M mode. On the A7C, video mode and M mode are side by side, so it's now a lot more convenient to switch between those two modes. And at number 5, one of the biggest differences between these two cameras, that EVF. Now, these two EVFs actually have the same resolution. They are both equally high res at about 2.3 million dots. It's just on the A7C, the magnification of the EVF is much smaller, making it much tougher to see what's going on. Number 6, the flip screen. The screen on the A7 III tilts up and down, but the one on the A7C tilts outwards, meaning it can be a front-facing screen great for filming yourself with, like right now. The A7C also has no recording limits when shooting video, unlike the A7 III, which will stop recording automatically at 30 minutes. And one of the biggest advantages on the A7C is the ability to have continuous eye-tracking autofocus in video mode. Wasn't available on the A7 III, huge improvement for shooting video in my opinion. The autofocus in video on the A7C is also just better and more reliable in general. The A7C also does not lose face and eye tracking AF when you are monitoring video externally through HDMI. It was a known issue on the A7 III that you lose face detect autofocus if you were monitoring through HDMI. That is happily no longer an issue on the A7C. The A7C's color size has also been tweaked a little. Noisy shadows on the A7C no longer appear magenta like on the A7 III. Instead, they seem to lean towards a somewhat less intrusive green. But one of the more hidden features that the A7C has is the ability to do post-stabilization using the camera's gyro metadata. As of now, only the ZV-1 A7S III and the A7C have this ability. It's not the most refined process, it's done using Sony's Catalyst Browse software, and it only works if you've disabled IBIS. But that's certainly another difference between the A7C and the A7 III. The A7C shutter is also different from the A7 III's in 3 ways. First, it's a different mechanism, so it sounds and feels different. Secondly, there does not seem to be a way to disable the electronic front curtain shutter on the A7C, so every time you take a photo, you only hear a single click. On the A7 III, electronic front curtain shutter is an option you can toggle, but that does not seem to be the case on the A7C. And third, the A7C's maximum shutter speed is 1/4000th of a second, while the A7 III's is 1/8000th of a second. Another minor but neat improvement on the A7C is how the camera no longer requires you to format the memory card when you switch between NTSC and PAL. And at number 14, the A7C only has one card slot as opposed to two on the A7 III. It's also now moved over to the left side of the camera body, another piece of good news if you are trying to use this on a small gimbal. The covers covering the ports are also now little doors on the A7C compared to loose little flaps on the A7 III. Yet another neat touch on the A7C. And finally, there is a small price difference. The A7C retails for $200 less than the A7 III, although at this moment you can probably find A7 III's on the used market, but not the A7C. Not yet at least. But when comparing retail prices alone, even though the A7C's retail price is lower, if anything, I would say that overall speaking, the A7C is an upgrade over the A7 III. But those have been 16 differences I've been able to spot between these two cameras. If you were considering between getting these two cameras or you were just hoping to find out a bit more about the new A7C, I hope this video has been helpful. So make sure before you click away from me talking way too much to check out some of my other videos. One last difference that I thought was a bit too minor to include, but I thought I'll just throw it in somehow anyway, is the shutter button on the A7C is the clicky type, while the ones on the A7 III is the squishy type.